I stood in the middle of that birthday party and watched my daughter-in-law parade my 10-year-old granddaughter in front of 30 horrified witnesses, with her head completely shaved, bleeding cuts visible on her scalp, and I knew right then this woman was going to prison, and I was taking my Sophie home forever. My name is Evelyn Bradford. I'm 79 years old, and I spent 37 years as a public school principal before I retired. In those decades, I learned to recognize cruelty disguised as discipline from a mile away. I've reported abuse, I've saved children, I've testified in court more times than I can count, but I never, not in my worst nightmares, imagined I'd have to use everything I learned to save my own flesh and blood from the woman my son married. 3 years ago, my Thomas died in a construction accident at 44, left behind his wife Jenna and their little girl Sophie, who was only 7 at the time. The grief nearly killed me. Losing your child at any age breaks something fundamental inside you. But I had to be strong for Sophie. Except I didn't know then what I was really going to have to be strong for. Because without my gentle, loving Thomas there to balance her out, Jenna's true nature started creeping out like poison through cracks in a wall. And that nature was something dark, something cruel, something that saw a grieving little girl not as a child who needed comfort, but as a target who needed to be controlled. What happened at that party last Saturday wasn't sudden. It was the culmination of 2 years of documented abuse, 6 months of legal preparation, and one grandmother who learned a long time ago that when it comes to protecting children, you don't hesitate. You act. This is the story of how a 79-year-old retired principal took down an abuser, rescued her granddaughter, and proved that age doesn't diminish the absolute fire you feel when someone hurts your family. If you're ready to hear how I did it, every calculated step, every piece of evidence I gathered, every moment I had to pretend I didn't see what was really happening until I had everything I needed, then stay with me. And please, hit that subscribe button, because this story needs to be told. There are grandparents out there right now watching their grandchildren suffer, thinking they're powerless. I'm here to tell you, you're not. The first time I truly saw what Jenna was capable of was 18 months after Thomas died. And I've replayed that moment in my mind 1,000 times since, wondering if I could have acted sooner. I had driven over to their house on a Tuesday afternoon, announced, which I'd started doing more frequently because Jenna had begun limiting my scheduled visits with Sophie to once a month. She'd told me over the phone just the week before that I was spoiling Sophie too much, that my generation didn't understand what real discipline looked like, that she needed to raise her daughter her own way without interference from a grandmother who was, in her words, too soft. Too soft. Me, a woman who'd run an inner-city public school for nearly 4 decades, who'd dealt with everything from gang violence to parental neglect to teachers who thought screaming at children was teaching. But I bit my tongue back then. I thought if I pushed too hard, she'd cut me off from Sophie entirely. When I knocked on the door that Tuesday, it took almost 5 minutes for anyone to answer. I could hear movement inside, and I remember my heart starting to beat faster, that old principal instinct kicking in, the one that knew when something was wrong even before I could name what it was. Jenna finally opened the door, and she looked annoyed, not surprised, not pleased to see me. Annoyed. She was blocking the doorway with her body, not inviting me in like she used to do in those first months after Thomas died when she still needed my help with everything. I told her I'd brought some books for Sophie. New releases I'd picked up from the library because my granddaughter had always loved reading, just like her father did at that age. Jenna's jaw tightened and she informed me that Sophie was grounded from books because she'd gotten a C on a spelling test, that she'd specifically told Sophie she wouldn't get to read anything fun until her grades improved. I'm going to tell you something about children and reading. You never, ever use books as punishment. Never. Taking away a child's access to reading is like taking away their ability to dream, to escape, to learn. In my 37 years in education, I'd fought that battle more times than I could count. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the book, punishment. It was when Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs behind Jenna. My beautiful granddaughter, who'd just turned 9 years old, was wearing a thin t-shirt and shorts even though it was November and their house was freezing. I could see her shivering from where I stood. Her hair, Thomas had loved her long auburn hair, had braided it himself every morning before school, was tangled and dirty, matted in places, and on her bare arms, I could see dark bruises, perfect finger-shaped marks like someone had grabbed her hard. Sophie saw me and her whole face lit up for just a second before she caught herself, before she looked at Jenna, and that light died. She called out that she wanted to come give Grandma a hug, her voice small and hopeful. Jenna turned and told her to go back to her room immediately, that she was grounded and that meant no visitors either, not even me. Then she looked back at me and explained, as if she was talking to a particularly slow child, that Sophie had been lying about doing her homework, that she'd been sneaking snacks after being told no, that she was becoming impossible to deal with and needed strict boundaries. I asked if I could come in, just for a few minutes, just to say hello to my granddaughter. Jenna actually laughed this short, harsh sound and said that wouldn't be a good idea. That Sophie needed to learn that actions had consequences, that I needed to respect her parenting decisions. Then she closed the door in my face, while my granddaughter stood at the top of those stairs shivering in inadequate clothing with bruises on her arms. I stood on that porch for a full minute after the door shut, my hands still holding those library books. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years, the cold, clarifying rage that comes when you realize you're looking at abuse, and the system hasn't caught up yet. When you know in your bones that a child is in danger but you don't yet have the proof to make anyone else see it. I got in my car, and I didn't go home. I drove straight to Ronald Pierce's office. Ronald had been the district attorney when I was principal at Jefferson Elementary, and we'd worked together on more child welfare cases than either of us wanted to remember. He'd retired the same year I did, but he still practiced family law. I walked into his office and I told him everything. The bruises, the isolation, the temperature of that house, and the clothes Sophie was wearing, the way my granddaughter's entire demeanor had changed, how the light had gone out of her. Ronald listened, and then he looked at me with those serious eyes and said what I already knew but didn't want to hear, that grandparents have very limited rights in custody situations, that Jenna was Sophie's legal parent and could restrict my access however she wanted, that unless I had concrete evidence of abuse, Child Protective Services might investigate but probably wouldn't remove Sophie from the home. Then he leaned forward and told me that if I was serious about this, if I truly believed Sophie was being abused, we needed to build an airtight case, document everything, photograph every bruise, every sign of neglect, keep a detailed log of every interaction, every denied visit, every concerning thing Sophie told me. And we needed to be smart about it, because if Jenna suspected I was building a case, she could cut me off entirely and I'd lose my only window into Sophie's life. That night, I started a journal. Page 1, dated November 15th, documented everything I'd seen that afternoon. The bruises, the cold house, the tangled hair, Sophie's desperate face at the top of the stairs. And I made a promise to my son, even though he was 3 years gone, I swore to Thomas that I would get his little girl out of that house, no matter how long it took, no matter what I had to do. What I didn't know that night, sitting at my kitchen table at 77 years old, starting a case file against my own daughter-in-law, was that it would take 2 more years of watching Sophie suffer, 2 more years of documenting every injury and every cruelty, 2 more years of pretending to accept Jenna's excuses while I built the legal foundation to take my granddaughter away from her forever. But Jenna made one critical mistake in all those months of thinking she had complete control. She underestimated what a grandmother with 3 decades of experience protecting children could do when someone threatened her family. For the next 1.5 years, I became someone I barely recognized, a spy in my own family, documenting abuse against my own granddaughter while smiling at the woman inflicting it. Jenna had cut my visits down to once a month, always supervised, always on her terms, but what she didn't account for was that I'd spent 37 years dealing with parents who didn't want me looking too closely at their children. I knew every trick, every workaround, every legal loophole. I started showing up at Sophie's school. Jenna couldn't control that I was listed as an emergency contact, and the school had known me for decades. I'd been principal at 3 different elementary schools in our district before retiring, and educators talk. They knew me, they trusted me. And when I quietly asked Sophie's 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Chen, if she'd noticed anything concerning, the floodgates opened. Mrs. Chen pulled me aside after school one day and told me that Sophie had changed dramatically over the past year. She came to school in dirty clothes sometimes, with her homework incomplete, and she'd started falling asleep in class. When Mrs. Chen had called Jenna about it, my daughter-in-law had exploded, accused her of targeting Sophie, and claimed the teacher was undermining her parenting. But what really made my stomach turn was when Mrs. Chen showed me the incident reports she'd filed with the school counselor. 3 separate occasions where Sophie had come to school with visible injuries. Once with a black eye that Jenna claimed came from Sophie running into a door. Once with a burn on her hand that was supposedly from Sophie touching the stove despite being warned. And once with a split lip that Jenna said happened when Sophie fell off her bike. The school counselor had reported all 3 incidents to Child Protective Services. Do you know what happened? CPS did home visits. Jenna, who could be charming when she needed to be, showed them a clean house, a well-stocked refrigerator, and a daughter who'd been coached to say everything was fine, without evidence of ongoing abuse, without Sophie willing to disclose what was really happening. CPS closed the case each time. That's when I understood the real depth of what I was facing. Jenna wasn't just cruel, she was calculating. She knew exactly how far she could push, exactly what excuses worked, exactly how to manipulate the system designed to protect children. I started taking photos every single time I saw Sophie. I bought one of those smartphones my grandson had been trying to get me to use for years, and I learned how to take pictures with timestamps. Every bruise, every time she showed up in weather-inappropriate clothing, every moment her eyes looked hollow and scared. Ronald advised me to get a social worker involved who could do independent documentation. He connected me with Patricia Morse, a woman in her 50s who'd worked in Child Protective Services for 20 years before going private. Patricia agreed to consult on the case, and she started attending school events where she could observe Sophie and Jenna together without it seeming suspicious. What Patricia documented over those months was chilling. She watched Jenna grab Sophie's arm hard enough to leave marks at a school open house. She observed my daughter-in-law berating Sophie in the parking lot for getting a problem wrong during a classroom presentation, calling her stupid and worthless where other parents could hear. She noted that Sophie flinched every time Jenna moved quickly near her, but we still didn't have enough. As Patricia explained to me one evening in Ronald's office, emotional abuse is notoriously hard to prove in court. We had documentation of injuries, but Jenna had plausible explanations for each one. We had observations of harsh parenting, but harsh wasn't illegal. What we needed was something undeniable, something so clear that no judge could look away. That's when Ronald brought up emergency custody. He told me that if I could get a judge to pre-approve an emergency custody order based on our existing documentation, then the moment Jenna did something that rose to the level of imminent danger, I could remove Sophie immediately without waiting for CPS or family court to act. It took 4 months of legal maneuvering. Ronald called in favors with Judge Victoria Chun, relation to Sophie's teacher, just one of those coincidences, who'd been on the bench for family court for 15 years. We presented her with everything: the photos, the incident reports, Patricia's observations, Mrs. Chen's concerns, the failed CPS investigations, and why they'd failed. Judge Chen looked at that file for a long time, and then she looked at me and asked if I was prepared for what getting emergency custody meant. She explained that I'd be taking on full parenting responsibility for a traumatized child at 78 years old, that Jenna would fight me with everything she had, that this would tear whatever remained of our family apart. I told her something I'd learned in 40 years of working with children, that sometimes protecting a child means burning down everything else around them, and you live with the ashes, because the alternative is living with their suffering. Judge Chen signed the pre-approval order 6 months ago. It sat in Ronald's office safe, waiting. The document stated that upon presentation of evidence showing imminent danger to the minor child Sophie Bradford, grandmother Evelyn Bradford was authorized to assume immediate emergency custody pending a full hearing. All we needed now was that evidence. And I knew, with the sick certainty that comes from watching someone's patterns, that Jenna would eventually give it to me. What I didn't expect was how public and horrific it would be. 3 weeks ago, Sophie called me. It was 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and my phone rang with her number, the cell phone Jenna had finally gotten her for emergencies only, with strict instructions never to call me, unless it was life or death. My granddaughter was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She kept saying she was sorry, that she knew she wasn't supposed to call, but she was scared. She told me that she'd gone into Jenna's room to borrow a hair tie because hers had broken and she couldn't find another one, and Jenna had found her there and gone crazy. Sophie whispered into the phone that Jenna was screaming about disrespect and boundaries and how Sophie thought she could just take whatever she wanted. And then, this is when my blood went cold, Sophie said that Jenna had threatened to shave her head bald so that everyone at school would know what happens to disobedient children. I kept my voice calm, even though everything in me was screaming. I told Sophie that she did the right thing calling me, that she was safe, that Grandma was going to make sure everything was okay. I could hear Jenna yelling in the background, and then Sophie quickly said she had to go, and hung up. I immediately called Ronald, told him everything. And he said something that made me understand just how carefully we'd been building this case all along. He said that if Jenna actually followed through on that threat, especially if she did it in any kind of public way, we'd have our evidence of imminent psychological and physical harm. Then he said something else. He told me that Jenna had been posting on social media about planning a big birthday party for Sophie. Her 10th birthday was coming up in 3 weeks. He'd been monitoring her accounts as part of our case building, and Jenna had invited the entire 4th grade class, all their parents, extended family. Ronald's voice was grim when he explained what he thought was happening. This wasn't going to be a birthday celebration. This was going to be a public humiliation, a demonstration of power, a way for Jenna to break Sophie's spirit so completely that she'd never dare disobey again. Abusers do this, he told me. They escalate, they perform their dominance, and they get sloppy when they think they're untouchable. I sat in my kitchen that night, 78 years old, and I realized that everything we'd built over the past 18 months, every photo, every report, every legal document was about to come to its conclusion. 3 weeks later, I drove to Sophie's birthday party with the emergency custody order in my purse, Ronald on speed dial, and the absolute certainty that this was the day I was going to bring my granddaughter home forever. What I didn't know was just how many witnesses Jenna was about to give me to her own cruelty. The morning of Sophie's 10th birthday party, I woke up at 5 a.m. with my heart pounding. I'd barely slept. I kept seeing that phone call from 3 weeks ago, playing in my mind, Sophie's terrified voice, telling me Jenna was going to shave her head. Part of me hoped I was wrong. Part of me prayed that maybe Jenna had just been angry in the moment, that she'd calmed down, that she wouldn't actually follow through with something so cruel. But I'd spent too many years watching abusers to believe in that kind of hope. When someone tells you who they are, you believe them. I called Ronald at 6 a.m. He was already awake, told me he'd been up since for thinking through every possible scenario. We went over the plan one more time. I would arrive at the party at the scheduled start time of 2 p.m. Ronald would be parked 2 blocks away with all our documentation, ready to move the moment I called. He'd already alerted Judge Chen that we might need her today, and she'd promised to be available. Patricia, our social worker, would also be there posing as just another parent from Sophie's class. Her daughter had graduated from Jefferson Elementary years ago when I was still principal there, so if anyone asked, she had a legitimate reason to know me. She'd document everything with her phone, professional and careful. I dressed carefully that morning. Navy blue dress, sensible shoes, my grandmother's pearl necklace that Thomas had given me before he died. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a respectable 79-year-old grandmother coming to her granddaughter's birthday party. Harmless, expected, easy to dismiss. That was the role I'd been playing for 18 months now with Jenna, the slightly confused elderly woman who didn't quite understand modern parenting, the grandmother who was too old-fashioned to grasp that children needed firm discipline. I'd swallowed my pride and played that part because it kept Jenna's guard down, made her think I was too weak or too out of touch to be a threat. She had no idea that behind that mask was a woman who'd spent nearly 4 decades fighting for children, who knew the legal system inside and out, who had connections throughout the education and child welfare network that I'd built over a lifetime of service. I arrived at Jenna's house at exactly 2 p.m. The front yard was decorated Boone Streamers, a rental bounce house in the driveway. Jenna had clearly spent serious money on this party, which struck me as odd, since she usually complained about being broke. But then, I understood this wasn't about celebrating Sophie. This was about appearances, about looking like Mother of the Year in front of all these witnesses. There were already about 15 children running around, and I recognized several parents I knew from school events. They greeted me warmly. "Bradford, how lovely to see you. Sophie must be so excited you're here." I smiled and chatted, and played my part perfectly. But Sophie wasn't outside with the other children. I worked my way through the crowd slowly, greeting people, accepting compliments on my dress, commenting on what a beautiful party Jenna had put together, all while my eyes scanned constantly for my granddaughter. She wasn't in the bounce house. She wasn't at the snack table. She wasn't anywhere. Jenna came out of the house around 2:30, and she was practically glowing. She had this bright, artificial smile plastered on her face as she moved through the crowd, playing the role of gracious hostess. When she saw me, something flickered across her expression: annoyance, maybe, or calculation, but she quickly covered it with that same fake warmth. She came over and gave me one of those air kisses that doesn't actually make contact, and told me how wonderful it was that I could make it, that Sophie would be so happy to see me. I asked where my granddaughter was, keeping my voice light and grandmotherly. Jenna waved her hand dismissively and said Sophie was just getting ready, that she'd be out soon, that we'd do cake and presents at 3 o'clock, getting ready for her own birthday party. That had started 30 minutes ago. I felt Patricia's eyes on me from across the yard. She was standing with a group of parents, phone in hand, looking casual but alert. I gave her the tiniest nod. We were both thinking the same thing: something was very wrong. More guests arrived. By 2:45, there must have been 30 children, and at least 20 adults crowded into that yard. The noise level was incredible: kids screaming on the bounce house, music playing from speakers Jenna had set up, parents chatting and laughing. It was chaos, but orchestrated chaos, a stage set for something. At exactly 3 p.m., Jenna turned off the music. The sudden silence made everyone stop and turn to look at her. She was standing on the back porch, and she had this strange expression on her face: excited, almost manic. She called out for everyone's attention, said she had something special to share before they sang happy birthday. That's when she went back into the house. The crowd waited, confused. Some of the kids started getting restless. Parents exchanged glances. I stood frozen, my purse clutched tight against my side, feeling the weight of that emergency custody order inside like it was burning through the leather. Then, the back door opened again. Jenna came out pulling Sophie by the hand, and I heard someone behind me gasp. Multiple people gasped, because my beautiful granddaughter, my Sophie, who'd just turned 10 years old, had her head completely shaved. Not shaved clean and neat, shaved roughly, with patches of different lengths, cuts visible on her scalp that were still bleeding slightly, raw red areas where the razor or scissors or whatever Jenna had used had scraped too hard. Sophie's face was swollen from crying, her eyes downcast, her whole body rigid with humiliation as Jenna dragged her in front of all these people, and Jenna was smiling. Actually smiling, like this was something to be proud of. She raised her voice so everyone could hear, and announced that before they celebrated, she wanted everyone to see what happens to children who disobey. She said that Sophie had gone into her room without permission, had touched her things, had shown complete disrespect, so she'd given her daughter the punishment she deserved, one that everyone would see, one that would teach Sophie about consequences. Jenna actually said that everyone at school would now know Sophie was problematic, that this was a lesson in respect. She was laughing as she said it, gripping Sophie's arm so tight that I could see her fingers digging into my granddaughter's skin. The silence in that yard was deafening. Parents were staring in absolute horror. Some of the children had started crying. I saw Mrs. Chen, Sophie's teacher, with her hand over her mouth, tears in her eyes. Several people had their phones out, and I realized they were recording not because they planned to, but because what they were witnessing was so shocking that their instinct was to document it. Sophie stood there shaking, humiliated in front of her entire class, her friends, their parents, everyone. Tears were streaming down her face silently. She wasn't even crying out loud anymore, just standing there like a broken thing while her mother displayed her shame like a trophy. And that's when something inside me went absolutely cold and absolutely clear. I'd spent 18 months being careful, strategic, patient, playing the role of the confused old grandmother who didn't understand modern discipline. But in that moment, watching my granddaughter, my Thomas's little girl, being tortured psychologically in front of 30 witnesses, I was done with masks. I walked through that silent crowd, and every step felt like I was shedding years. I wasn't 79 anymore. I was every version of myself that had ever fought for a child: the young teacher who'd stopped a parent from hitting a student in the parking lot, the principal who'd called police on an abusive father, the grandmother who'd promised her dying son she'd protect his daughter. I reached Sophie and Jenna, and I looked my daughter-in-law directly in the eyes. My voice came out quiet but absolutely steady when I told her to let go of my granddaughter. Right now. Jenna laughed, that same harsh sound I'd heard so many times before. She said I couldn't tell her what to do, that Sophie was her daughter, that she could raise her however she wanted. She said I was just a meddling old woman who needed to mind my own business. I didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't give her any warning at all. I simply took Sophie's other hand gently, and I said to my granddaughter in the calmest voice I could manage that we were going to Grandma's car now, that everything was going to be okay, that she was safe. Jenna's face went red. She started yelling that I wasn't taking Sophie anywhere, that she'd call the police on me for kidnapping, that I had no rights. She actually tried to yank Sophie away from me. That's when I pulled out my cell phone, that smartphone I'd learned to use just for this case, and I held it up so Jenna could see the screen. I told her I'd already called 911 before I walked over, that police were on their way, that she'd just committed child abuse in front of 30 witnesses, all of whom had seen her inflict physical and psychological harm on a 10-year-old child. For the first time in 2 years, I saw actual fear cross Jenna's face. Ronald appeared at the gate. I'd texted him the moment Jenna had brought Sophie outside. He was carrying his briefcase, and he looked like exactly what he was, a lawyer about to destroy someone's entire world. He walked straight up to us and informed Jenna, in his professional courtroom voice, that he was holding an emergency custody order signed by Judge Victoria Chen, that based on this public act of child abuse, Evelyn Bradford was legally authorized to remove the minor Sophie Bradford from this residence immediately. Jenna's mouth opened and closed. She looked around at all the faces staring at her parents, who were horrified, who were still recording on their phones, who were already whispering to each other about calling the police themselves. She looked back at me, and I could see her trying to process how this had happened, how the confused old grandmother she'd been dismissing for 2 years had just pulled a legal document out of thin air. She demanded to see the order. Ronald handed it to her calmly. She read it, and I watched the color drain from her face as she realized it was real, it was official, and it had been signed 6 months ago. 6 months. That meant I'd been planning this long before today. That every time I'd nodded along with her excuses, every time I'd played the part of the harmless grandmother, I'd been building a case against her. That's when the police arrived. 2 officers who'd been patrolling nearby when my 911 call went through. They took one look at Sophie's head, at the bleeding cuts, at the crowd of witnesses, and their expressions went hard. The female officer knelt down next to Sophie and spoke to her softly, asking if she was okay, if her mom had done this to her hair. Sophie, my brave girl, nodded silently. The other officer asked Jenna to explain what happened, and my daughter-in-law, who'd been so confident 30 minutes ago when she'd dragged Sophie out to humiliate her, suddenly started backtracking. She claimed it was just a haircut, that she was teaching Sophie about consequences, that all these people were overreacting. The officer looked at the cuts on Sophie's head, looked at the raw patches where the skin had been scraped, looked at the finger-shaped bruises on Sophie's arm from where Jenna had been gripping her. Then he asked if anyone had recorded what happened. At least 5 parents raised their phones. They watched the videos right there. They heard Jenna's words about making sure everyone at school would know Sophie was problematic. They saw her laughing while Sophie cried. They saw the public humiliation, the physical evidence of harm, everything. And that's when they arrested her. Right there, at her daughter's birthday party, in front of everyone. They handcuffed Jenna and informed her she was being charged with child abuse and endangerment of a minor. I knelt down next to Sophie, who was shaking like a leaf. I told her so softly that we were going to go to Grandma's house now, that she never had to come back here, that I was going to keep her safe forever. She collapsed into my arms, this tiny broken girl, and I held her while police documented the scene, and Ronald spoke to witnesses, and Patricia took official photographs for our case file. But here's what Jenna still didn't understand as they put her in that police car. This wasn't a sudden reaction. This wasn't a grandmother losing her temper and acting rashly. This was the culmination of 18 months of documentation, of legal preparation, of strategic patience. Every photo I'd taken, every incident report Mrs. Chen had filed, every observation Patricia had made, the pre-approved custody order from 6 months ago, the network of professionals I'd assembled, lawyer, social worker, judge, teachers, the evidence file that was 3 inches thick. Jenna had thought she was untouchable, thought that being Sophie's legal parent gave her unlimited power, thought that I was just a confused old woman who'd eventually give up and go away. She never realized that the confused act was exactly the Dayton act, a strategic choice to make her lower her guard while I built an airtight case around her. And today, when she decided to publicly torture a 10-year-old child to prove her dominance, she'd handed me exactly the evidence I needed to take Sophie away from her forever. They think age makes you weak, makes you powerless, makes you easy to dismiss. They forget that age also brings experience, connections, and the absolute clarity of purpose that comes from having lived long enough to know exactly which battles are worth burning the world down for. I drove Sophie straight to County General Hospital with Patricia following in her car. Ronald stayed behind to give his statement to police and collect contact information from every single witness at that party. He told me later that not one parent refused. They were all horrified, eager to help, some of them crying as they described what they'd seen. Sophie didn't speak during the entire 15-minute drive. She sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, her small hands folded in her lap. I kept glancing over at her, at the brutal evidence of what Jenna had done visible on her scalp, and I had to focus on the road to keep from pulling over and just holding her. When we got to the emergency room, I told the intake nurse exactly what had happened, that my granddaughter had been physically assaulted by her mother, that there was an active police case, that I had emergency custody, and needed a full medical examination documented for legal purposes. The nurse took one look at Sophie's head and immediately got a doctor. They brought us back to a private room within minutes. Dr. Sarah Kim was probably in her early 40s, and she had this gentle way of moving that immediately put Sophie at ease. She introduced herself to Sophie first, not to me, which I appreciated. She explained that she was going to examine her and take some pictures, and that nothing would hurt. She just needed to see and document any injuries. Sophie nodded silently, and I held her hand while Dr. Kim carefully photographed her head from every angle. The cuts were worse than I'd realized in the chaos of the party. There were at least 7 distinct lacerations where the razor or scissors had cut into her scalp. Some were still bleeding slightly. The skin was inflamed and raw in patches, like whatever Jenna had used had scraped across it multiple times. Dr. Kim asked Sophie gently if her mom had done anything else that hurt her. My granddaughter hesitated, looking at me like she was asking permission to tell the truth. I squeezed her hand and told her it was okay, that she could tell the doctor anything and no one would be angry with her. Sophie's voice came out barely above a whisper. She said that when Jenna was shaving her head this morning, she'd been crying and moving, and Jenna had gotten mad and held her down by her arm really tight. She said it hurt, but she'd tried to stay still because Jenna kept yelling that if she didn't stop squirming, it would be worse. Dr. Kim asked if she could look at Sophie's arms. When Sophie held them out, there were clear handprint bruises on both upper arm's 4 fingers, and a thumb on each side, purple and yellow, recent but not from today. These were a few days old at least. The doctor asked if there were any other places that hurt. Sophie looked at me again, and I saw something in her eyes, shame, or fear, or maybe just exhaustion from carrying secrets too heavy for a 10-year-old. She said her back hurt sometimes, and when Dr. Kim asked if she could look, Sophie nodded. What we saw when she lifted Sophie's shirt made my vision actually blur with rage for a moment. There were bruises across her back in various stages of healing, some fresh and dark, some fading to green and yellow. They weren't random, they were patterned, linear, like she'd been hit with something, a belt maybe, or a wooden spoon. At least a dozen marks scattered across her small back and shoulders. Dr. Kim's face remained professionally calm, but I saw her jaw tighten. She documented everything with photographs, measuring each bruise, noting the different ages based on coloring. Then she asked Sophie very gently how she'd gotten the marks on her back. Sophie started crying, not loud, just silent tears running down her face. She said that Jenna hit her with a wooden spoon when she was bad, that it had been happening for a long time, that she'd tried to be good but she kept messing up and making Jenna angry. I had to step out of the room for a minute. Patricia came with me, and I stood in that hospital hallway at 79 years old and I wept. Not quiet, dignified, tears, gut-wrenching sobs for every time my granddaughter had been hurt while I was taking photos and building cases and being patient and strategic, for every night she'd gone to bed in pain while I slept safely in my own house, for every moment she'd thought no one was coming to save her. Patricia put her hand on my shoulder and said something I've thought about every day since. She told me that if I'd acted sooner without the proper documentation, without the legal framework, Jenna would have won. That family court is notoriously difficult for grandparents, that without ironclad evidence, Sophie would have been returned to that house and I would have been cut off entirely, unable to help her at all. She said I'd done exactly what I needed to do to save Sophie permanently, that the pain of waiting was the price of making sure Jenna could never hurt her again. I pulled myself together and went back into the room. Dr. Kim had finished her examination and was sitting next to Sophie, talking to her about her favorite subjects in school, just keeping her calm while we waited for the next steps. The doctor told me she was calling in the hospital's child abuse specialist and that a social worker from CPS would need to come evaluate. I informed her that we already had Patricia Morse, a private social worker, who'd been documenting the case for 18 months. Dr. Kim looked relieved. She said that would expedite things, that Patricia could coordinate directly with the CPS investigator. Within an hour, we had a CPS caseworker named Janet Rivera in the room with us. She was a woman in her 60s, and I recognized her name. She'd worked in the district when I was still principal, though we'd never met directly. When I introduced myself, her eyes widened slightly. She told me she knew my reputation, that I'd been legendary in the system for fighting for kids. Janet interviewed Sophie while I waited outside with Patricia. It took about 45 minutes. When they finished, Janet came out and told me that based on Sophie's disclosure, the medical evidence, the witness statements from the party, and Patricia's 18 months of documentation, she was recommending immediate removal from parental custody and supporting my emergency custody petition without reservation. She said she'd rarely seen a case this well documented, that normally they were working with fragments, trying to piece together evidence while fighting time and legal barriers, but I'd handed them everything: a complete timeline, photographic evidence, witness testimony, medical documentation, professional observations, everything needed to make this permanent. Janet looked at me and said something I'll never forget. She said that most grandparents in my situation don't have the resources or knowledge to build a case like this, that most of them just watch helplessly while the system fails their grandchildren. She said Sophie was incredibly lucky that her grandmother had the experience and connections to save her. But here's what I told Janet: I didn't feel lucky. I felt like I'd failed Sophie for 2 years. Like every day I'd had to smile at Jenna and pretend I didn't see what was happening was a betrayal of my granddaughter's trust. Like the strategic patience that saved her legally had cost her so much pain. Janet shook her head and explained something that helped me understand what we'd actually accomplished. She said that in cases like this, one of two things typically happens. Either the grandmother acts rashly based on suspicion without evidence, gets shut down by the system, and loses all access to the child, leaving the child completely unprotected, or the grandmother reports to CPS repeatedly. CPS does investigations that the abusive parent manipulates, nothing gets proven, and the situation escalates until either the child dies or runs away. What I'd done, she said, was create a third option, by using my professional knowledge and connections to build an airtight case while maintaining access to Sophie. I'd ensured that when we acted, it was final, that Jenna couldn't talk her way out of it, couldn't claim misunderstanding, couldn't manipulate the system one more time. Sophie was released from the hospital around 7 p.m. with prescriptions for antibiotic ointment for her scalp lacerations and documentation that would become part of the permanent legal record. Dr. Kim told her that her hair would grow back, that the cuts would heal, that in a few months there wouldn't be visible scars, but we all knew that the invisible scars would take much longer. I took Sophie home to my house, the house where her father had grown up, where she'd spent countless happy weekends before Thomas died. I'd already prepared her room months ago, hoping and planning for this day. It had her favorite books on the shelves, a comfortable bed with soft blankets, her stuffed elephant that she'd left at my house during a visit, and I'd secretly kept. That first night, Sophie took a shower, and I helped her wash her wounded head gently. I put the antibiotic ointment on the cuts as carefully as I could. I gave her one of my soft t-shirts to sleep in because we'd left her house with nothing. We'd deal with getting her things later. And when I tucked her into bed, she looked up at me with those eyes that looked so much like Thomas's and asked if she was really safe now. I sat on the edge of her bed and I told her the truth. I said that yes, she was safe, that I had legal custody of her, that her mother couldn't take her back, that this was her home now for as long as she needed it, which I hoped would be forever. Then Sophie asked the question I'd been dreading. She asked why I hadn't taken her away sooner, if I knew what was happening, and I had to be honest with her, because children deserve honesty, even when it's hard. I told her that I'd wanted to take her away from the very first moment I saw she was being hurt, that every day I didn't act was torture for me, but that if I'd acted without the right legal foundation, her mother could have won in court, and Sophie would have been sent back with no one able to protect her at all. I explained that sometimes protecting someone you love means doing the hard thing instead of the quick thing. that I'd spent 18 months building an unbreakable case so that when I finally got her out, she would never have to go back. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. She said she'd known I was trying to help, that she'd seen me taking pictures of her bruises, asking careful questions, showing up at school more often, that she'd known Grandma was planning something and she just had to wait. She'd known. This whole time, this 10-year-old child had understood that I was fighting for her, even when it looked like I was doing nothing. I held her until she fell asleep that night, sitting on her bed in the dim light of her new room, and I made a promise to Thomas that I should have made at his funeral 3 years ago. I promised that I would never let Sophie be hurt again, that she was my responsibility now, my priority, my whole world, that I might be 79 years old, but I had enough strength left to raise one more child, and this time I'd do it right. Over the next 72 hours, things moved fast. Ronald filed the formal custody petition with all our documentation. CPS completed their investigation and recommended permanent removal from parental custody. Jenna was formally charged with child abuse, assault on a minor, and endangerment. And I learned something that made the entire picture even darker. When the police searched Jenna's house as part of the investigation, they found records showing that she'd been receiving Sophie's Social Security survivor benefits $1,200 a month that Thomas's death had entitled Sophie to, meant to help cover the cost of raising her. Jenna had been depositing those checks and spending them on herself. New clothes, restaurant meals, the expensive birthday party decorations, all paid for with money that was legally Sophie's. That's when we understood why Jenna had fought so hard to keep Sophie. It wasn't about love or even about control. It was about money, about maintaining access to that monthly check, about keeping the cash cow, regardless of what it costs a child. Ronald added financial exploitation of a minor to the charges, because not only had Jenna been torturing my granddaughter physically and emotionally, she'd been stealing from her as well. Within a week, I had temporary custody. Within 6 weeks, after Jenna was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison for the assault and abuse charges, I was granted permanent legal custody. Sophie was mine. Finally, legally, permanently mine. But the fight wasn't over yet, because Jenna, even from prison, wasn't done trying to hurt us. 2 weeks after Jenna was sentenced, the letters started arriving. The first one came on a Tuesday afternoon. I recognized the prison facility's return address immediately: County Women's Correctional, where Jenna was serving her 3-year sentence. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened. Ronald had advised me that I didn't have to accept any communication from her, that the court order gave me full discretion. But something made me open it. Maybe it was the decades I'd spent as a principal, reading angry letters from parents who thought I'd wronged their children. Maybe it was just morbid curiosity. Or maybe I needed to know if there was any remorse in her at all. There wasn't. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten in Jenna's sharp, angular script. She started by claiming that I'd manipulated the entire situation, that I'd turned everyone against her because I'd never liked her, that this was my revenge for her marrying Thomas. She said the party incident was being blown out of proportion, that it was just a haircut, and everyone was overreacting because I'd poisoned them against her. Then, it got worse. She wrote that she was filing an appeal, that her new lawyer had assured her that grandparents' rights cases were notoriously shaky, that once she got out she'd fight for Sophie back and I'd lose because the courts always favor the biological parent. She claimed Sophie would never truly love me the way she loved her real mother, that I was just a temporary placeholder. The letter ended with a threat barely disguised as concern. She wrote that raising a 10-year-old at my age was dangerous, that something could happen to me: a fall, a stroke, a heart attack, and then what would happen to Sophie? She said I should think carefully about whether I was really doing what was best for Sophie, or just being selfish. I read that letter twice, and then I did something Jenna wouldn't have expected. I called Ronald and told him to add it to our case file. Because what Jenna had just done was document in writing that she felt no remorse for abusing Sophie, that she still saw the child as property to fight over, and that she was already planning to violate the custody order the moment she was released. Ronald said this was perfect evidence for the parental rights termination hearing that was scheduled in 3 months. That letter alone showed she was unfit and dangerous. But the letters kept coming. 1 a week, sometimes 2, each one more desperate and angry than the last. She wrote about how ungrateful Sophie had always been, how difficult she was to raise, how I'd stolen her daughter to punish her. She never once wrote anything that sounded like a mother who missed her child. It all sounded like someone who'd lost the possession and wanted it back out of spite. I didn't respond to any of them, but I documented every single one. Meanwhile, life with Sophie was slowly finding a rhythm. She started therapy twice a week with Dr. Marcus Chen, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma from parental abuse. Dr. Chen told me after the third session that Sophie had significant PTSD symptoms and nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting adults, emotional regulation issues. But he also said something encouraging. He said that Sophie's early years with Thomas had given her a foundation of secure attachment that was protecting her psychologically, that she remembered being loved unconditionally by her father, and that memory was helping her believe she deserved to be loved now, that my presence as a stable, safe grandparent was allowing her to begin healing. The nightmares were the hardest part. Sophie would wake up screaming 3 or 4 times a week, convinced Jenna was coming to take her back. I'd go to her room and hold her while she cried, promising her over and over that she was safe, that I had legal custody, that her mother was in prison and couldn't hurt her. Dr. Chen suggested we create a safety plan that Sophie could refer to when she felt scared. We sat down together one afternoon and made a list. Item 1, Grandma has legal custody. Item 2, Mom is in prison for 3 years. Item 3, even when Mom gets out, the judge said she can't see you. Item 4, Grandma's lawyer, Mr. Ronald, is making sure you stay safe. Item 5, lots of people know what happened and are protecting you. Sophie kept that list on her nightstand. I'd find her reading it sometimes before bed, like she was reminding herself it was real. School was complicated. Sophie had missed the last week of 4th grade due to the party incident and everything that followed. When summer ended and it was time to start 5th grade, she was terrified. She didn't want to go back to the same school where everyone had seen what Jenna did to her. I understood that fear completely. So I did something I'd never thought I'd do at 79 years old. I enrolled her in a different school across town, Valley View Elementary, where I'd been principal for 12 years before retiring, where the current principal, Marcus Thompson, had been my assistant principal and was still a close friend. I called Marcus and explained the situation. He'd already heard about it through the Education Network. News travels fast when something this shocking happens. He told me that Sophie would be welcomed at Valley View, that he'd personally make sure the staff understood her situation and protected her privacy, that they'd work with Dr. Chen to provide whatever support she needed. Sophie started 5th grade at Valley View in September, 3 months after the party. Marcus had prepared her teacher, Mrs. Linda Hayes, who was experienced with traumatized children. Mrs. Hayes sent me an email after the first week saying that Sophie was quiet but engaged, that she was smart and caught up academically despite missing school, that she seemed to relax a little more each day. But the real turning point came from an unexpected place. Mrs. Hayes had assigned the class to write about someone they admired. Sophie came home that day and asked me if she could write about me. I told her, of course, but I was curious why. Sophie said that Mrs. Hayes had asked them to think about someone brave, someone who'd protected them or stood up for what was right. She said she wanted to write about how her grandma had saved her. I sat with her at the kitchen table while she worked on that assignment, and I read over her shoulder as she wrote in her careful 10-year-old handwriting about how I'd documented everything, how I'd built a legal case, how I'd walked through that party and taken her away from her mom forever. She wrote about feeling safe for the first time in years, about knowing that Grandma would always protect her. Mrs. Hayes called me after she read that essay. She said she'd cried, that Sophie's writing showed both trauma and incredible resilience, that my granddaughter was going to be okay because she had me. But not everyone was supportive. Jenna's mother, Sophie's other grandmother, Margaret, called me in October. We hadn't spoken since the arrest. Margaret had been at the party, had seen everything, but she'd still sided with her daughter. Family loyalty, I suppose, even when your family is a monster. Margaret demanded to know why I was keeping Sophie from her, said she had a right to see her granddaughter, that I was being vindictive by cutting off Jenna's entire family. I listened to her rant for about 30 seconds before I cut her off. I told her that she'd watched her daughter shave a terrified child's head in front of 30 witnesses and done nothing, that she'd seen the bruises and the fear and the abuse for 2 years and made excuses, that she'd enabled Jenna's cruelty by pretending it was just strict parenting. I said that Sophie was in therapy learning to feel safe again. and exposing her to anyone who'd defended her abuser would destroy that progress. That until Margaret could acknowledge what Jenna had done and showed genuine remorse for not protecting Sophie, she would not be in our lives. Margaret hung up on me. She called back 3 times over the next week, leaving increasingly angry voicemails. Finally, Ronald sent her a formal cease and desist letter. She stopped calling, but the isolation was hard for Sophie. She'd lost not just her mother, but her entire maternal family. Jenna's sister Amy had reached out once, saying she wanted to maintain a relationship with Sophie. But when I asked if she believed Jenna had abused Sophie, Amy had hesitated and said she thought things were probably more complicated than they seemed. That was the end of that conversation. I would not allow anyone in Sophie's life who thought child abuse was complicated. So we built our own family from people who'd earned the right to be there. Patricia, our social worker, came by monthly to check on Sophie and became someone my granddaughter trusted implicitly. Ronald brought his wife Barbara to visit, and Barbara had been a children's librarian for 30 years. She and Sophie bonded over books. Immediately, Dr. Chen became a steady presence in our lives. Marcus Thompson invited us to his family's Thanksgiving dinner that November, introducing Sophie to his daughters who were teenagers but incredibly kind to her. Mrs. Hayes organized a small birthday party at school for Sophie's 11th birthday in November. Low-key, just 5 carefully chosen classmates, nothing that would trigger memories of last year's horror show. Slowly, carefully, Sophie began to understand what family was supposed to look like, not biological obligation or control or possession, but chosen love, earned trust, deliberate kindness, and through it all, those letters from Jenna kept coming. Each one documented evidence that she was not rehabilitating, not reflecting, not growing. She was just waiting and planning and threatening, which is exactly what I needed for the parental rights termination hearing that was scheduled for January, 7 months after the party incident, for months after her conviction, because Jenna was about to learn that while she'd been writing angry letters from prison, I had been building the final case that would sever her legal connection to Sophie forever, and this time, there wouldn't be any appeals or second chances. This time, I was going to make absolutely certain that my granddaughter would never have to fear her mother again. Ronald had warned me that terminating parental rights was difficult, that courts were extremely reluctant to permanently separate parent and child, but he also said we had something most cases didn't have: clear evidence of ongoing danger, even while the abuser was incarcerated. Those letters were going to be Jenna's undoing, because in trying to threaten me, she'd created a written record of exactly why she should never be allowed near Sophie again. Sometimes the best strategy is simply giving your enemies enough rope to hang themselves, and Jenna had just handed me an entire coil. The parental rights termination hearing was scheduled for January 15th. That gave us 3 months to build the final case that would permanently remove Jenna's legal rights to Sophie. Ronald explained that this was different from the criminal trial that had sent Jenna to prison, or even the custody hearing that had given me guardianship. This was about severing the fundamental legal bond between parent and child, something courts viewed as a last resort, reserved for only the most extreme situations. We needed to prove not just that Jenna had abused Sophie, which we'd already done, but that she was permanently unfit to parent, that rehabilitation was impossible or unlikely, and that termination was in Sophie's best interest. We needed to show a pattern of behavior so dangerous and unchangeable that the court had no choice but to cut the legal ties forever. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you looked at it, Jenna was giving us everything we needed. By December, I'd received 17 letters from her. Not a single one showed remorse. Not one acknowledged that shaving Sophie's head in public was abusive. Not one expressed concern for Sophie's well-being, or asked how she was recovering. Instead, every letter was filled with blame for me, blame for the witnesses who'd testified against her, blame for the justice system, blame for everyone except herself. Ronald had me create a spreadsheet documenting every letter, date received, key phrases, threats made. Any mention of Sophie was meticulous work, but I'd spent decades as a school administrator. Documentation was second nature to me. But it was one particular letter, received in early December, that became the centerpiece of our case. Jenna wrote that she'd been talking to other inmates about custody battles, and several had told her about ways to work the system once she got out. She actually wrote that she planned to complete the prisons, parenting classes, and anger management programs so she could show the court she'd changed, even though, and I quote, It's all just checking boxes to get what you want. She wrote that once she was released, she'd file for custody again, and that judges usually give parents second chances, especially when they've done the programs. She said she'd learned her lesson about doing discipline where people could see it, that she'd be smarter next time about how she handled Sophie. She'd literally confessed in writing that she planned to fake rehabilitation, regain custody, and continue abusing Sophie more carefully. When I showed that letter to Ronald, his eyes went wide. He said that in 20 years of family law practice, he'd never seen an abuser document their future plans so clearly. It was like Jenna had written her own psychiatric evaluation, proving she was a sociopath, incapable of change. We immediately filed a motion to include all 17 letters as evidence in the termination hearing. Jenna's public defender, she'd lost her private attorney when she couldn't pay him from prison, tried to block it, arguing that the letters were private correspondence. The judge denied the motion. She ruled that since Jenna had voluntarily sent the letters, knowing I could share them with my attorney, and since they were directly relevant to the question of her fitness as a parent, they were admissible. But we needed more than letters. We needed expert testimony that Sophie would be harmed by any future contact with Jenna. Dr. Chen, Sophie's therapist, agreed to testify. He prepared a comprehensive psychological evaluation showing Sophie's PTSD symptoms, her progress in therapy, and his professional opinion that reunification with Jenna would cause severe psychological damage. He documented Sophie's nightmares, her panic attacks, her terror that her mother would somehow take her back. Dr. Chen told me privately that in his professional opinion, Sophie's case was one of the most clear-cut he'd ever seen. The abuse had been severe, public, and deliberately humiliating. The abuser showed no remorse and had explicitly threatened to continue. Any judge who ruled for reunification would be, in his words, committing psychological malpractice. We also had Dr. Kim from the hospital testify about the physical injuries she'd documented, the scalp lacerations, the bruises in various stages of healing, the evidence of repeated physical abuse over months or years. Her testimony would show that this wasn't a one-time incident, but a pattern of escalating violence. Patricia, our social worker, prepared her report covering the 18 months of documentation she'd gathered before the party incident. Every bruise I'd photographed, every concerning behavior she'd observed, every instance of Jenna's controlling and abusive treatment of Sophie. Her professional assessment was damning. She concluded that Jenna met the clinical definition of an abusive parent with narcissistic traits, and that Sophie's safety required permanent separation. But here's what surprised me: we also got witnesses I didn't expect. Mrs. Chen, Sophie's fourth-grade teacher, volunteered to testify about the changes she'd seen in Sophie over the past year, how withdrawn and fearful she'd been in Jenna's care, versus how she was slowly opening up now that she lived with me, how Sophie's academic performance had improved, how she was making friends again, how the light was coming back into her eyes. 3 parents from the birthday party also agreed to testify. They wanted to go on record about what they'd witnessed, not just the head-shaving incident, but Jenna's demeanor afterward, how she'd been laughing and proud, how she'd shown no recognition that what she'd done was wrong, how they'd been so disturbed that several had reported it to CPS independently even before the police arrived. Even Judge Chun, the judge who'd signed my emergency custody order back in June, submitted a written statement supporting the termination. She wrote that in her 15 years on the family court bench, she'd rarely seen documentation as thorough as what I'd provided, or an abuser as clearly dangerous as Jenna. We were building a fortress of evidence that no appeal could crack, but in mid-December, something happened that threatened everything. Jenna's public defender filed a motion claiming that Jenna had completed an intensive parenting program in prison and had shown significant behavioral change. They submitted certificates from the program, letters from her prison counselor saying she'd been a model inmate, even a letter from the prison chaplain saying she'd expressed remorse for her actions. Ronald called me immediately after he received the filing. He said this was Jenna's attempt to create exactly the narrative she'd written about in her letters, that she'd changed, that she deserved a second chance, that the court should delay the termination. I asked him what our chances were. He was honest with me. He said that judges want to believe people can change, especially parents, that if Jenna could present herself as rehabilitated, some judges might decide to give her supervised visitation after her release, which would open the door to eventually regaining partial custody. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that letter where Jenna had written about checking boxes to get what you want, about how she'd specifically said she'd be smarter about how she hurt Sophie next time, about how she saw these programs not as genuine rehabilitation but as tools to manipulate the system. The next morning, I called Ronald back and told him we needed to address this head-on, that we couldn't let Jenna's performance in prison programs erase the written evidence of her real intentions. Ronald agreed. He filed a response motion, arguing that completion of programs while incarcerated doesn't demonstrate true behavioral change, especially when the defendant had explicitly stated in writing that she viewed such programs as mere requirements to check boxes. We attached the December letter where Jenna had laid out her entire strategy. We also requested that the court appoint an independent forensic psychologist to evaluate Jenna, not just interview her, but conduct comprehensive psychological testing designed to detect manipulation and antisocial personality traits. The judge granted our request. She appointed Dr. Richard Foster, a forensic psychologist who'd worked with the court system for 25 years, specializing in evaluating parents in custody cases. Dr. Foster visited Jenna in prison twice in December for a total of 6 hours of interviews and testing. He administered something called the MMPI, which is a psychological test designed to identify personality disorders and detect when someone is trying to fake good responses. He also did what's called a PCLR, which assesses psychopathic traits. When Dr. Foster's report came back in early January, just a week before the hearing, it was devastating for Jenna's case. He concluded that Jenna showed significant narcissistic personality traits, lack of empathy, manipulation of social situations, and what he called instrumental aggression, meaning she used violence purposefully to control others rather than losing control emotionally. He noted that her prison behavior was consistent with someone who understands how to perform compliance while maintaining underlying antisocial attitudes. Most critically, he assessed her risk of future abuse as high and her capacity for genuine behavioral change as poor. He recommended permanent termination of parental rights with no contact, stating that even supervised visitation would likely cause psychological harm to the child. When Ronald sent me Dr. Foster's report, he included a note that said simply, "This is over. We won, but I didn't celebrate, because I knew that even when we won the hearing, even when the judge signed the termination order, there would be appeals." Jenna had already shown she'd fight until she had no options left, and she still had 2.5 years of prison sentence to serve. 2.5 years to plot and plan, and look for any angle to regain control over Sophie. What I didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that Jenna was about to make one final move that would backfire so spectacularly it would seal her fate forever. Because while we were building our legal case, Jenna was building something else. Something that showed just how far she'd go to hurt me, even if it meant destroying herself in the process. And when it all came out during the hearing, even the judge, who'd seen decades of family court drama, looked genuinely shocked at how depraved one person's need for control could become. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. on January 15th. I woke up at 5 that morning, after maybe 3 hours of sleep, my 17-9-year-old body aching from tension I'd been carrying for days. Sophie was still asleep down the hall. I'd explained to her that today was the day when the judge would make the final decision about whether her mother could ever try to take her back. Dr. Chun had helped me find the right words: honest, but not terrifying; clear, but age-appropriate. Sophie had asked if she'd have to go to court, and I'd been so grateful to tell her no. That the judge had already decided she didn't need to testify, that the adults would handle everything. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table going over Ronald's notes one more time, even though I'd memorized them days ago. All our evidence was organized in 3-inch binders: the letters, the medical reports, the psychological evaluations, the witness statements, the photographs. 18 months of documentation that would fit in a banker's box, but represented hundreds of hours of strategic, heartbreaking work. Ronald picked me up at 7:30. He'd offered to drive so I wouldn't have to worry about parking or navigating downtown traffic. During the 20-minute drive, he went over what to expect. The hearing would likely take most of the day. Jenna would be brought from prison to testify. Her public defender would present her rehabilitation narrative. We'd present our evidence. The judge would likely rule from the bench, or within a few days. What he said next made my hands go cold. He told me that I needed to be prepared to see Jenna, to hear her speak, maybe even to hear her say things about me that were cruel or untrue. He said abusers often tried to shift blame during these hearings, to paint themselves as victims of misunderstanding or manipulation. I told Ronald I'd spent 37 years dealing with parents who blamed me for their children's behavioral problems, who accused me of bias and persecution when I documented their abuse. I said I could handle whatever Jenna threw at me. I was wrong. We arrived at the courthouse at 8:15. The family court building was older, with marble floors and wooden benches that reminded me of churches. Patricia was already there, along with Dr. Chen. Dr. Kim arrived a few minutes later. The three parents who'd volunteered to testify came together, looking nervous but determined. At 8:45 they brought Jenna in. She was wearing prison oranges, her hands cuffed in front of her, accompanied by two corrections officers. She'd lost weight, her face looked gaunt, harder than I remembered. Her hair was pulled back severely. But what struck me most was her eyes. They locked onto me immediately as she entered the courtroom, and there was nothing human in that gaze. Just cold, calculated hatred. She smiled. Not a warm smile or even a nervous one. A smile that said she knew something I didn't. The bailiff called us to order. Judge Victoria Chunda, same judge who'd signed my emergency custody order 7 months ago, and took the bench. She was in her early 60s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that had seen too many terrible things people did to children. She looked at the case file in front of her, then looked at all of us, and stated that this was a hearing to determine whether to terminate the parental rights of Jenna Bradford regarding the minor child Sophie Bradford. Jenna's public defender, a young woman named Amanda Pierce who looked fresh out of law school, went first. She presented Jenna's completion certificates from prison programs, parenting classes, anger management, substance abuse counseling, even though Jenna didn't have a substance problem. Amanda argued that her client had used her incarceration time productively, that she'd shown genuine remorse, that she'd completed every available program to better herself. Then Amanda called Jenna to testify. Jenna took the stand and swore to tell the truth. Her voice was soft, contrite. She looked at the judge with tears in her eyes and began to speak about how ashamed she was of what had happened at the party, how she'd been overwhelmed by grief from losing her husband, by financial pressure, by the stress of single parenting, how she'd made a terrible mistake in a moment of anger and had been punishing herself ever since. She said that completing the prison programs had opened her eyes to how badly she'd handled things, that she'd learned healthier discipline strategies, that she understood now that what she'd done to Sophie was wrong, and all she wanted was the chance to apologize to her daughter and show her she'd changed. It was a performance, a calculated, practiced performance, and I could tell from Judge Chun's expression that she wasn't buying it, but she was a good judge. She'd listened to everything before deciding. Then Amanda made her critical argument. She said that while Jenna's actions had been wrong, they didn't merit permanent termination of parental rights, that supervised visitation after her release would allow Sophie to maintain a connection with her mother while keeping her safe, that completely severing the parent-child bond was too extreme a response. When Amanda finished, Ronald stood to cross-examine Jenna, and this is where he was brilliant. He didn't attack her directly. He didn't call her a liar or challenge her tears. Instead, he calmly asked her about the letters she'd sent me from prison. He had them admitted into evidence, all 17 of them, and he read sections aloud. He read the part where she called me manipulative and accused me of turning people against her. Jenna tried to explain that she'd been angry when she wrote that she didn't mean it. He read the part where she'd said I was too old to care for Sophie and something might happen to me. Jenna claimed she'd just been worried about Sophie's future, not threatening me. Then he read the December letter, the one where Jenna had written about completing programs to check boxes and being smarter about discipline. Next time, so people wouldn't see. The courtroom went completely silent. Amanda's face went pale. Jenna's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Ronald asked Jenna very simply whether she'd written those words, whether she'd explicitly stated that she viewed rehabilitation programs as performance rather than genuine change, whether she'd acknowledged that she planned to continue controlling Sophie, just more carefully. Jenna tried to backtrack. She claimed the letter was taken out of context, that she'd been venting to me the way family members do, that she didn't mean it literally. Ronald looked at Judge Chen and said that the defendant had just demonstrated exactly why termination was necessary, because even under oath, even in a hearing that would determine her parental rights, she couldn't be honest. She continued to manipulate, to minimize, to lie. Then it was our turn to present evidence. Dr. Chen testified about Sophie's PTSD, her nightmares, her terror of her mother. He stated his professional opinion that any contact with Jenna would cause severe psychological harm. Dr. Kin testified about the injuries, the scalp lacerations, the bruises in various stages of healing, the evidence of repeated abuse. Patricia testified about the 18 months of documentation, the pattern of escalating control and violence. The three parents from the birthday party testified about what they'd witnessed. One of them, a father named David Martinez, actually cried on the stand while describing how his own daughter had nightmares for weeks after seeing what Jenna did to Sophie. By noon, the evidence was overwhelming. Even Amanda looked defeated, like she knew her client was going down and there was nothing she could do about it. We broke for lunch. Ronald told me it was going well, better than expected. He said Judge Chen was clearly leaning toward termination and would likely rule today. But when we returned at 1:30, Amanda stood and said the defense had one more witness. She called Margaret Bradford, Jenna's mother, Sophie's other grandmother. I hadn't known Margaret was coming. She hadn't been on the witness list. Ronald objected, but Amanda argued that she'd only decided to call Margaret that morning after seeing our evidence, and Judge Chen allowed it. Margaret took the stand, and she looked at me with pure venom. Then she turned to the judge and began to speak. She said that I'd been jealous of Jenna from the moment Thomas brought her home, that I'd never accepted her as part of the family, that after Thomas died, I'd seen an opportunity to steal Sophie away and had manipulated the situation to make it happen. She claimed that Jenna's discipline had been strict but not abusive, that I'd exaggerated normal parenting into a criminal case. She said that she'd known Jenna her whole life, and her daughter was not an abuser. She was a grieving widow doing her best under impossible circumstances with a difficult child. Then Margaret said something that made my blood boil. She said that I was too old to be raising a 10-year-old, that Sophie needed a younger parent who could keep up with her, that it was selfish of me to take Sophie when I might die or become incapacitated at any moment. Ronald cross-examined her with surgical precision. He asked if she'd been at the birthday party. She admitted she had. He asked what she'd witnessed. She tried to minimize it, saying it was just a haircut that got out of hand. He showed her the photographs of Sophie's head, the cuts, the bleeding, the raw patches. He asked if that looked like a haircut that got out of hand. Margaret claimed Sophie must have been moving around, making it worse. Then Ronald asked the question that destroyed her credibility completely. He asked if she'd reported Jenna to authorities or tried to intervene at the party. Margaret admitted she hadn't. He asked if she'd checked on Sophie after the arrest to see if she was okay. Margaret said she'd tried to call me, but I wouldn't answer. Ronald pointed out that according to phone records, Margaret had never called me after the arrest. She'd made no attempt to check on her traumatized granddaughter. Instead, her only action had been to visit Jenna in prison and write letters to the prosecutor demanding the charges be dropped. Judge Chen asked Margaret directly whether she believed Jenna had abused Sophie, and Margaret, who'd been confronted with all the evidence, who'd seen the photos and heard the testimony, said no. She said she believed this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a vindictive ex-mother-in-law. That's when I understood why Ronald hadn't objected harder to Margaret testifying, because she'd just demonstrated to the judge that Sophie's maternal family was not only unsupportive, but actively in denial, that there was no safety net there, no one on Jenna's side who would protect Sophie if reunification happened. After Margaret stepped down, Judge Chen asked if there was any additional evidence. Amanda said no. Ronald said he had one final document to submit, Foster's forensic psychological evaluation that had just been completed. Judge Chen read it right there on the bench. It took her 15 minutes. The courtroom was absolutely silent while she read page after page of Dr. Foster's assessment. When she finished, she set it down and looked at Jenna with an expression I'd seen on my own face dozens of times in my career, the look of someone confronting the reality of true evil disguised as ordinary life. Then Judge Chen said she was ready to rule. She stated that, in her 15 years on the family court bench, she'd presided over hundreds of cases involving allegations of abuse and neglect, that she took the termination of parental rights seriously and never ordered it lightly, but that this case was among the most clear-cut she'd ever seen. She said that Jenna had committed deliberate, calculated child abuse, that she'd shown no genuine remorse, that her letters demonstrated ongoing danger, that Dr. Foster's evaluation indicated she was incapable of safe parenting, that even under oath, in a hearing that would determine her future relationship with her daughter, she'd continued to lie and manipulate, Judge Chen looked directly at Jenna and said that some parents forfeit their rights through their actions, that Jenna had destroyed her own relationship with Sophie through cruelty, and no amount of prison programs could change that fundamental truth. Then she signed the order terminating Jenna's parental rights permanently. No visitation, no contact, no future attempts at custody. The legal bond between Jenna Bradford and Sophie Bradford was severed forever. Jenna screamed, actually screamed in the courtroom, calling the judge biased and corrupt, calling me a monster, calling Sophie ungrateful and difficult. The corrections officers had to physically restrain her while she shouted that this wasn't over, that she'd appeal, that she'd never stop fighting. Judge Chen waited until Jenna was removed from the courtroom. Then she looked at me and said something I'll never forget. She said that Sophie was fortunate to have a grandmother who'd fought so intelligently and persistently for her, that most children in abusive situations don't have an advocate with the knowledge, resources, and determination to save them, that I'd done everything right. The hearing was over. Ronald shook my hand. Patricia hugged me. Dr. Chen smiled and said he'd tell Sophie the good news in their next session. The parents who'd testified looked relieved, like they'd done their civic duty and could finally move past the trauma of that birthday party. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exhausted, devastated, like I'd just watched my son's widow, someone who'd been part of our family for 12 years, revealed as a monster who'd tortured her own child. Because this wasn't a victory, it was a tragedy with the best possible resolution. Sophie was safe, but she'd still been hurt, still been traumatized, still lost her mother, in the worst possible way, not through death, but through the discovery that her mother had never really loved her at all. Ronald drove me home. I went straight to Sophie's school and picked her up early. Dr. Chen had advised me to tell her the results in person, in a safe environment, as soon as possible. We sat in my living room, the living room where her father had grown up, where family photos lined the walls, showing Thomas at every age from baby to adult. I held Sophie's hands and I told her that we'd been to court today, and the judge had made her final decision. I told her that her mother would never be able to take her back, that the court had ended her mom's legal rights permanently, that Sophie was mine now, completely and forever, and nothing would ever change that. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked if this meant she was bad, if losing her mom meant something was wrong with her, and I pulled her into my arms and I told her the truth that every abused child needs to hear. I said that nothing, absolutely nothing that happened was her fault, that her mother's choices were about her mother's failures, not about Sophie's worth, that Sophie was loved and valuable and deserving of safety, and she always had been. I told her that family isn't just about biology, that I was her grandmother and I was her mom now, and I would be both for as long as she needed me, that we were going to build a life together full of love and safety and all the happiness she deserved. Sophie cried, but they were different tears than I'd seen before, not scared tears or hurt tears, relief tears, like she'd been holding her breath for 2 years and could finally exhale. That night, for the first time since she'd come to live with me 7 months ago, Sophie slept through the night without nightmares. And when I checked on her before I went to bed, I found her holding that safety list we'd made, the one that listed all the reasons she was protected. She'd crossed out the old items and written one new line at the top in her careful handwriting. My mom can never hurt me again, the judge said so. I'm grandma's forever. Sometimes justice takes time. Sometimes protecting someone you love means being patient and strategic and documenting everything while your heart breaks. Sometimes you have to watch suffering you can't immediately stop because stopping it the wrong way would make it permanent. But when justice finally comes, when the law catches up with the truth, when an abuser is permanently stripped of their power, it's worth every terrible moment it took to get there. Jenna had spent 2 years thinking she was untouchable. She'd spent 7 months in prison thinking she could manipulate her way back into Sophie's life. She learned the hard way that when you abuse a child whose grandmother spent 4 decades protecting children, you don't just face one old woman. You face an entire lifetime of knowledge, connections, experience, and absolute determination. And you lose. 5 months have passed since that hearing in January. It's June now, and Sophie turns 11 next month. This time, we're planning a small party, just her closest friends from Valley View Elementary, Dr. Chen and his family, Ronald and Barbara, Patricia, and Mrs. Hayes. No elaborate decorations, no performance for crowds, just people who love Sophie, celebrating that she's here and safe and healing. Her hair has grown back. It's about 3 inches long now, thick and healthy. The auburn color, just like Thomas's was at her age. She still runs her hand over her head sometimes, like she's checking that it's real, that it's hers, that no one can take it away again. Dr. Chun says that habit will fade with time, that it's part of how she's reclaiming ownership of her own body. The nightmares have mostly stopped. She hasn't woken up screaming in over 2 months. She still has anxiety. Sometimes she gets nervous when we pass someone in public who looks like Jenna, or when she sees prison uniforms on TV shows. But Dr. Chen says her progress has been remarkable, that children are resilient when they have safety and support. School ended 2 weeks ago, and Sophie's report card made me cry all A's and B's. Glowing comments from Mrs. Hayes about how Sophie has blossomed this year, how she's made friends and participates in class and shows genuine joy in learning. That last phrase got me genuine joy. Something Jenna had tried so hard to beat out of her. We've started new traditions. Sophie and I, every Sunday morning, we make pancakes together and she tells me about her week. Every Friday afternoon, we go to the library, my old haunt from decades of bringing Thomas the Rond. She picks out books while I sit and remember what it was like raising my son at the same age. She calls me grandma most of the time, but sometimes, late at night when she's half asleep, she calls me mom. The first time it happened, I almost corrected her. Then I realized, I am her mom now, not replacing her father, never that, but filling the role Jenna abandoned through her cruelty. And if Sophie needs me to be both grandmother and mother, then that's what I'll be for as long as I'm breathing. I'm 80 years old now. My knees hurt when I stand up too fast. I get tired earlier than I used to. I had to learn how to help with 5th grade math homework, which has changed completely since I was teaching 3 decades ago. Some days, I look in the mirror and wonder how I ended up raising an 11-year-old at this age, when most of my friends are traveling or playing golf or enjoying quiet retirements. But then Sophie comes home from school and throws her arms around me and tells me about her day. And I remember exactly why I'm doing this. Because some things are more important than comfort or rest or an easy life. Some battles are worth every ache and pain and sleepless night. Jenna filed 2 appeals from prison. Both were denied. The evidence was too overwhelming. The psychological evaluations too clear. Her parental rights termination is permanent and irreversible. When she's released in 2 more years, she'll have no legal connection to Sophie whatsoever. If she tries to contact us, it's a criminal offense. If she shows up at our home or Sophie's school, she'll be arrested immediately. Margaret, Sophie's other grandmother, sent one more letter in March. It was addressed to Sophie, but I opened it first, like the court order allows me to do. It was full of guilt-tripping nonsense about how Sophie should forgive her mother, how family is forever, how she was turning her back on her own flesh and blood. I burned it. Then I sent Margaret a formal letter through Ronald stating that any further attempts to contact Sophie would result in a restraining order. We haven't heard from her since. Sophie asked me about her mother only once since the hearing. It was in April, during a therapy session that I attended with her and Dr. Chen. She wanted to know if her mom ever loved her, or if she'd always just been pretending. Dr. Chen and I had discussed how to answer this question if it came up. The truth was complicated, maybe. Jenna had loved Sophie in her own broken way, but that love had been so twisted by her need for control that it became indistinguishable from abuse. But Sophie was 11. She didn't need complicated. I told her that I thought her mother had loved the idea of having a daughter, but she didn't know how to love an actual person who had her own thoughts and feelings. That some people are so damaged inside that they can't love others properly, even when they want to. That it wasn't Sophie's job to fix her mother or make her capable of love. I said that what mattered now wasn't what Jenna felt or didn't feel. What mattered was that Sophie was surrounded by people who loved her the right way, unconditionally, safely, without trying to control or hurt her. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that showed me how much she'd grown. She said she didn't need her mom to love her anymore because she had enough love from the people who actually knew how to give it. She'd chosen herself, chosen safety over obligation. Chosen the family that protected her over the one that hurt her. That's what I hope stays with her forever. Not the trauma, though, that will always be part of her story, but the knowledge that she deserves love that doesn't hurt. That family is something you build, not just something you're born into. That she's strong enough to survive terrible things and wise enough to accept help from people who care. Last week, we were sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset, something we do most evenings now. Sophie asked me what I was thinking about. I told her I was thinking about her daddy, about how proud he'd be of the young woman she's becoming. She asked if I thought her dad would be mad that I took her away from her mom, and I said no. I told her that the very last thing Thomas said to me before he died was asking me to take care of his little girl, that if anything happened to him, he trusted me to protect her. I said I'd failed at that for a while, that I hadn't seen who Jenna really was until it was too late, until Thomas was gone and Sophie was trapped, but that when I finally understood what was happening, I'd used everything I learned in 40 years of protecting children to save her. Sophie leaned against my shoulder, something she does now when she feels safe, and told me I didn't fail. She said she'd always known Grandma would save her eventually. She'd just had to wait until I could figure out how. The faith of children is a humbling thing. Even in the worst circumstances, Sophie had believed I was coming for her. And somehow, despite being only 9 and 10 years old while it was happening, she'd understood that I was building something, planning something, working toward the day I could take her away forever. I asked her what she wants to be when she grows up. She said maybe a teacher, like I was, or maybe a lawyer, like Mr. Ronald, or maybe someone who helps kids who are in bad situations, like Miss Patricia. She wants to protect other children the way she was protected. She's 11 years old and already understands that surviving something terrible means you have the power to help others survive it too. That's Thomas's daughter. That's my granddaughter. Strong and compassionate and determined to turn her pain into purpose. Next month, after her birthday party, we're going to visit Thomas's grave together. It's something I do alone usually, but Sophie asked if she could come. She wants to tell her daddy that she's okay now, that Grandma kept the promise, that he doesn't have to worry about her anymore. I think about that moment at the birthday party, sometimes standing in that yard full of horrified witnesses, while Jenna displayed Sophie's shaved head like a trophy. How, in that instant, everything I'd planned for 18 months converged into a single moment of action. How all the documentation and legal preparation and strategic patience culminated in me taking Sophie's hand and walking her out of that house forever. People have asked me since then how I stayed so calm, how I managed to execute such a complex plan under that kind of pressure, how a 79-year-old woman took down an abuser so completely. The answer is simple. You don't need to be young to be fierce. You don't need to be physically strong to fight back. You need to be smart, patient, and absolutely unwilling to accept defeat when a child's safety is at stake. I spent 37 years as a school principal learning how systems work, how abusers operate, how to document evidence that courts can't ignore. I built relationships with lawyers, social workers, judges, and educators who trusted my judgment. I learned that sometimes protecting someone means playing the long game, even when every instinct screams to act immediately. And I learned that being underestimated is one of the most powerful weapons you can have. Jenna thought I was just a confused old woman who'd eventually give up. She never imagined that every time I smiled and played nice while she made excuses for Sophie's injuries, I was photographing those injuries and building a case file. She never realized that my age and experience weren't weaknesses, they were advantages she couldn't compete with. So here's what I want people to understand, especially grandparents who are watching their grandchildren suffer and feeling powerless. You are not powerless. You have decades of life experience, connections, and knowledge that abusers don't expect you to use. Document everything. Build your case carefully. Use the system instead of fighting against it. And when the moment comes to act, be absolutely decisive. But also know this it's a long road. The legal system moves slowly. Proving abuse takes time and evidence and patience. You'll have to watch someone you love suffer while you build the foundation to save them permanently. It will break your heart every single day. You'll question whether you're doing the right thing, whether you should just act now and deal with consequences later. Stay the course, because rushing in without preparation means the abuser wins in court and gets the child back with you completely cut off, and then no one can save them. I look at Sophie now reading on the couch with the evening light coming through the window, her growing hair falling across her face, completely absorbed in her book, and I know every terrible moment was worth it. Every night I lay awake documenting abuse. Every time I had to smile at Jenna while my stomach turned. Every photograph of Sophie's injuries that I forced myself to take instead of just grabbing her and running. Because she's safe now. Permanently, legally, irreversibly safe. And she really knows that she's loved and valued and protected. That family doesn't have to mean suffering. that getting older doesn't mean getting weaker, that grandmothers who've spent lifetimes fighting for children don't give up just because the battle is hard. Next week, we're going to look at middle schools for next year. Sophie wants to try out for the drama club, which makes me smile because her father loved theater too. We're talking about getting a dog, something Sophie's wanted for years, but Jenna never allowed. We're planning a summer reading challenge together, because that's what teachers and grandmothers do. We're building a life, a normal, safe, happy life where childhood gets to be about learning and growing and discovering who you are, not about surviving your own mother. If my story reaches even one grandparent out there who's watching their grandchild suffer and feeling too old, too tired, too powerless to help, please hear this. You are not too old. You are not powerless. Your age is wisdom. Your experience is strength. Your love is unstoppable. Fight for them. Document everything. Build your case. Use every connection you've made over decades of life. Be smart and patient and absolutely relentless. And when the moment comes to act, don't hesitate. Walk through that crowd of witnesses. Take that child's hand and bring them home to safety. Because some battles are worth everything. And saving a child is always, always worth it. So, if you've made it this far in my story, I want to know something. I want to know I'm not alone in this. Drop your city in the comments below. Let me see where you're watching from. Let me know that there are other grandparents out there fighting for their grandchildren, or teachers who've protected students, or just people who believe that children deserve better than what some parents give them. And please, hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like mine that need to be told. More grandparents who need to know they're not powerless. More children who need adults to fight for them the way Sophie needed me to fight for her. My name is Evelyn Bradford. I'm 80 years old. I'm a retired school principal, a grandmother, and now a mother again, to the most precious girl in the world. And I'm living proof that you're never too old to save a life. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about Sophie. And thank you for believing that love, real, protective, unwavering love always finds a way to win. Now, it's your turn. Tell me where you're from. Tell me you're out there. Tell me we're building a community of people who won't look away when children need help. Because together, we're stronger than any abuser. And our stories matter.